In this session, we will introduce debugging and how we can leverage it to troubleshoot our apps. We will start by defining troubleshooting debugging before we jump into debugging in OutSystems. Then we will introduce the main steps of how to debug apps in OutSystems. Finally, we will explain how to debug a producer module. Any application is subject to many different types of errors that can happen during execution. Some errors can be detected by static code analysis during development and compilation. However, some are only detected during execution where they are not expected. Troubleshooting an application focuses on finding those errors and fixing them quickly. Debugging is one of the most common and important techniques that we can use while troubleshooting. What is debugging? Debugging is essentially a troubleshooting technique that helps detect errors in software code through a methodical analysis of the code. It also helps remove the errors found to guarantee that the code runs according to desired specifications. How can we debug an app? There are 4 main steps to take. The first step is to set the breakpoints in the code and then start the debugger. After this, it is a matter of running the application and then debugging the code. Let's look into these steps in detail. Breakpoints are places where code execution will be suspended later on. To add breakpoints, in logic flows, right-click an element and add the breakpoint. Service Studio then registers the breakpoints and lists them in the debugger panel. Then, while debugging the application, whenever the execution goes through a piece of code with an active breakpoint, the execution will automatically stop. Breakpoints can be disabled and removed at any time. Now that the breakpoints are defined, it is time to start the debugger, which can be done in the Debugger menu of Service Studio. When debugging, a new browser window automatically opens with the application. Then, the interaction with the app should happen in that browser window. While the debugger is running, new breakpoints can be added, and existing ones removed. When interacting with the app, the execution will stop in every active breakpoint that we define in the code. The debugger stops when the new browser window is closed. Whenever the execution reaches a breakpoint, it is suspended. This allows the developer to execute the code step by step. In this process, it is easy to see what is happening with the code, since it is possible to analyze the value of variables and understand when the application is not behaving as expected. During interaction with the application in the browser during debugging, when the execution stops in a breakpoint, the focus returns back to Service Studio. In Service Studio, we can then find the regular debugging operations. The options Step Over, Step Into, and Step Out allow the step-by-step execution of the code to help the developer analyze its behavior. There's also options to stop the debugger and suspend, abort, or continue the request. Finally, we have the Break on All Exceptions option to suspend the execution of the application whenever an exception is raised. When developers are doing a step-by-step execution, they can inspect the values of the variables in different scopes of the application. We can have a look at the values of the variables that are being used in the current statement in the In Use tab. Also, there's a chance to look for the variables that are local to the scope of the execution, and also the values in the screen widgets when we are in a screen action. We can also inspect client variables and site properties if they exist. Finally, there's the possibility to define watches over some variables, which can be accessed at all times, even if the execution is outside of the scope of the variable. We can select a variable to be under watch when the debugger is on. By default, breakpoints stop the execution of requests on the module we are in. For instance, if we are debugging a module called Product Manager, any request to that module in the browser will stop on breakpoints of the module. However, applications often have multiple modules, or actually execute code from other modules. When that's the case, the developer should have a look at that code, since it may be affecting the behavior of the application. We can also add breakpoints in that code, but that's not enough to make the execution stop there. Going back to the example of the Product Manager module, let's consider that there is an action being used from a Product Core module, which also has active breakpoints. When debugging the Product Manager module, to make sure that the execution stops on breakpoints in the Product Core module, the Product Core needs to have the Product Manager defined as entry module, as we can see in the example. Whenever this happens, the Product Manager module needs to have the Consumer as entry module, to make sure that every request in the consumer stops in the Product Manager module breakpoints.